The Kokoda campaign is the most significant battle in Australian history, spanning from the 21st of July until the 16th of November 1942. In the Kokoda campaign, there were 625 Australian deaths and at least 1,600 Australian soldiers who entered the campaign wounded. Australia played the role of defending the Kokoda airstrip and Port Moresby from the Japanese forces. Although the campaign involved multiple battles with the reserve army soldiers being heavily outnumbered, the Chocos dug in and managed to hold the Japanese advances off until battle-hardened Anzac reinforcements arrived.
During the Kokoda campaign, the conditions faced while fighting in the battle were harsh. These conditions were consistent and were extremely cold throughout the war. The landscape along the trail was very challenging as it was steep and had deep valleys with a dense jungle. Because of these narrow valleys, the Australian soldiers were fighting in very muddy ground as it would rain a lot during the day. Soldiers had no spare clothes, so throughout the sleepless nights they were constantly muddy and wet. This mud would most likely dry on their clothes and skin if it was not raining. Often during the battles, the supplies would run short and people were left to ration their food until more arrived. A lot of tropical diseases like malaria reduced the ability to fight in a lot of men.
The plan for the Japanese army was to take over Port Moresby and hold the Kokoda airstrip. Australians were worried that if Japan managed to reach Port Moresby, that they would bomb and attack the Australian mainland. Of course, this wasn't the case, but it meant that for the first time the Australian soldiers were defending their country, meaning that the battle was more important to them. The Japanese Imperial Force had planned that after they had captured Port Moresby, they would have control of Papua, and a base which allowed them to attack Australian mainland and would allow shipping through the Pacific.
Australia had to restrict the build-up of the Japanese Imperial Army from building up in Papua New Guinea. This was important because if the Japanese had managed to build up their forces in Port Moresby, they would have left the Australian mainland vulnerable, and Japan would become a direct threat to Australia. 22nd of July 1942, the Japanese soldiers encountered their first resistance 1 kilometre east of Awala. The 11th Platoon and 39th Battalion faces the Japanese forces who were far more superior numbers-wise. As Australian troops were outnumbered and outgunned, the 39th Battalion withdrew to Kokoda. 28th of July 1942, Japanese soldiers attacked Kokoda facing the 39th Battalion. The commanding officer of the battalion was mortally wounded. The 39th Battalion is driven out and falls back to Daniki. 8th of August 1942, the 39th Battalion are able to retake Kokoda from only a few Japanese troops, and they are able to hold Kokoda Plateau for 2 days. 12th of August 1942, the 21st Infantry Brigade arrive in Port Moresby from Australia. The 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th Battalions are set up along the Kokoda Trail. 14th of August 1942, the 39th Battalion fell to Izarava and dug there. 26th of August 1942, the Japanese soldiers attacked Izarava in the morning with 3 battalions. During that afternoon, the 2nd 14th Battalion arrived and the 39th Battalion refused to leave as they are heavily outnumbered.
30th of August 1942, a Japanese Major General Hori was very frustrated as the battle was still continuing. Major General Hori thought to get his huge reserves to attack, which made the Australians withdraw from Ishiwara after fighting well.
31st of August to 15th September 1942, the commander of the 21st Brigade, Arnold Potts, digs in with 1,000 troops at Brigade Hill. On September 8th at 4:30, Major General Hori outnumbered Australia's 6-1, so he launches a 3-pronged attack on the front, rear, and flank. Potts is unable to dislodge the Japanese, so they all withdraw. Although there were many casualties, Potts succeeds by delaying the Japanese by 3 crucial days. 11th of September 1942. Australian troops have withdrawn to Iobawa, but as they get there, a flanking move goes wrong and the Australians are pushed even further back to Amida Ridge. With a strong defensive point and heavy artillery support, the Australian forces are able to strike out effectively against the Japanese. 21st of September 1942. The battalions are dominating no man's land at Amida Ridge and Iobawa. 28th of September 1942. Having no word for withdrawal, the Japanese receive orders to advance to the rear and begin fighting a withdrawal along the Owen-Stanley Ranges. 2nd of November 1942, Kokoda village has now been recaptured by Allied forces and Japan flee.
This is a primary source that depicts Australian soldiers standing in the Kokoda village after it was recaptured from the Japanese. The source shows us the importance of occupying the Kokoda village and how proud the Australian soldiers were after recapturing it. This source tells us that the Battle of Kokoda was one of, if not the most important battles during the entire campaign. This is because after capturing Kokoda, Japan was on the back foot and struggling to get supplies to their troops. While the Australian troops were at Kokoda, they could fly supplies in and keep their troops fresh. This picture is a primary source from the Kokoda campaign that demonstrates how severe the terrain was. While fighting the Japanese, the Australian soldiers had to navigate through the extreme landscape and dense jungles. These stairs were also used to transport ammunition, food, and the native carriers took the wounded to safety. This primary source tells us how difficult it was for the Australian soldiers to navigate themselves around the battlefield. The jungle just adds significance to how important the battle was because it meant that the Australians had to fight even harder and discover and use different tactics to defeat the Japanese.
This picture is a secondary source about Private Bruce Kingsbury. Bruce was a part of the 2nd to 14th Battalion that arrived on 26th of August 1942 in the afternoon. Bruce went straight into battle when he arrived, armed with a Bren gun. Bruce was able to clear a 100-metre path straight through the enemy, killing hundreds of Japanese soldiers. Bruce was awarded the Victoria Cross for his efforts in the battle. This secondary source represents how significant Bruce was for this battle. Bruce was able to change the playing field alone with his actions to provide his fellow battalions an easier chance to win. This action of bravery possibly made this battle continue for a lot longer than it should have, until a Japanese general was so frustrated he made a huge reserve fight. Arnold Potts was trying to delay the Japanese from pushing forward, so Bruce's actions came in very handy and provided the significant delay of the Japanese.
The Kokoda campaign was Australia's most important battle because of many reasons, the main being how the battle helped forge the Anzac spirit. The reason for this is that while the Australian soldiers were outmanned 20-1 and heavily outgunned, they still managed to successfully defend against a strong Japanese army. This victory over Japan demonstrates how this battle was crucially important to Australia. This is because if the Australian soldiers hadn't successfully defended the Japanese, then Japan would have been a direct threat to the Australian mainland. Furthermore, the victory over Japan announced to the world that Japan was not an invincible army. This is due to Japan having never lost a battle on land until the Kokoda campaign.